In the grand halls of London's most exclusive estates, where whispers traveled faster than truth and secrets were the currency of survival, there lived a woman whom society had deemed unworthy of love, beauty, or happiness.
I shouldn't be
Her name
here.
was Charlotte Ashford, and her story is one of the most remarkable transformations ever witnessed by the British aristocracy, a transformation that would challenge everything society believed about worthiness, value, and the true meaning of beauty. Charlotte was the youngest daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, a man whose name had been synonymous with power and prestige for 3 generations. The Pemberton family occupied one of the most coveted positions in English society. They had wealth beyond measure, connections that reached into Parliament, and a reputation for producing beautiful daughters who married advantageously. But Charlotte was not like her 3 older sisters, who had been born with faces that launched suitors from across Europe and the Caribbean. Her sisters possessed that particular combination of symmetry and refinement that society had deemed essential for female worth. Charlotte had been born with something society deemed catastrophic, a birthmark, a large, dark mark that covered nearly the entire left side of her face. It was a port wine stain, the kind of marking that appeared in one in every few thousand births, but which in Victorian society might as well have been a scarlet letter. The mark resembled a map of some distant continent, spreading from her temple down to her jawline in shades of deep purple and dark crimson. It was not, objectively, hideous. But in the eyes of aristocratic society, where appearance was everything, where a woman's value was determined almost entirely by her marriageability and her ability to produce beautiful children, the mark was a catastrophe. Her father, the Earl, had taken one look at her as an infant and turned away, unable to bear the sight of his tainted legacy. He had left the nursery without a word and had not returned for 3 days. When he did finally see her again, he made a decision that would define her entire childhood: she would be hidden. Not from the servants, for they were below notice, but from society. From visitors. From any situation where she might be seen by people who mattered. Her mother, the Countess, had spent years trying to find remedies for what she considered a terrible affliction. She had hired physicians from Paris, consulted dermatologists from Vienna, purchased expensive creams from apothecaries that promised miraculous results. She had considered covering the mark with makeup, but the mark was too large, too persistent. Nothing worked. The mark remained, a permanent reminder of something the family could not control, could not fix, and therefore could not forgive. Charlotte grew up in the shadows of her family's grand homes, first in their townhouse in London, then at their country estate in Gloucestershire. While her sisters were paraded through ballrooms in gowns that cost thousands of pounds, attended by suitors who competed for their attention, Charlotte was kept hidden away. She was educated at home by tutors, fed separately from the family during important meals, and most importantly, kept far away from any situation where she might embarrass the Pemberton name. The servants, though, were kind to her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Wells, would sneak her extra portions at dinner. The gardener would show her the most beautiful roses, selecting the prettiest ones for her to arrange in her small room. The librarian who came to shelve books in the family library would set aside the most interesting volumes for her to read. They treated her with the quiet respect that working people often showed to those who were suffering, seeing in her isolation something of their own invisible struggles. Her sisters married well during her late teens and early 20s. The eldest to a duke with estates in Scotland, the second to a baron with interests in shipping, the third to a wealthy industrialist. Their weddings were the talk of London, elaborate affairs with hundreds of guests, orchestras, and menus that took weeks to plan. The Countess, beaming with pride, presided over each celebration like a queen. Charlotte was not invited to any of them. She was told it was for her own protection, to spare her the humiliation of witnessing her sister's triumphs when she could never have the same. But she understood the truth, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the family did. She was a shameful secret, the flaw in an otherwise perfect pedigree. Her presence at these celebrations would only cast a shadow over her sister's joy, or worse, raise questions that the family could not answer without admitting the depth of their cruelty. Instead, on the days her sisters married, Charlotte remained in the country house, walking alone in the gardens, reading alone in the library, eating alone in her room. She would imagine what it might feel like to wear a wedding gown, to have a room full of people applaud your union with someone who loved you. But imagination was all she had, and she learned, over time, to be grateful for even that small comfort. By the time Charlotte was 24 years old, she had resigned herself to a life of isolation. She had learned to find contentment in small things, a perfectly tended garden, a well-written novel, the loyalty of a few servants who saw her as human rather than as an embarrassment. She had learned to be invisible, to move through her family's homes without drawing attention, to make herself small so that her presence might not offend. She had given up hoping for marriage, for that would be impossible. She had given up hoping for a career or a profession, as even her minor daughters could never be taken seriously by society. She had given up hoping that her family might one day accept her, for their rejection had calcified into something too permanent to shift. She had learned to believe, in her deepest heart, that she was exactly what everyone told her she was, worthless, unmarriageable, a burden that her family bore only out of obligation. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to her in her small sitting room by a servant with sympathetic eyes. The letter bore the seal of her father. Her hands shook as she opened it, for her father had not written to her in 7 years. The letter was brief and businesslike. Charlotte, your mother and I have received an offer that requires your participation. You will be married within the month to Marquess Ashworth, the Marquess of Blackthorn. The matter has been arranged and is not subject to negotiation. Pack your belongings. You will leave for his estate in Wiltshire on the 15th of this month. You are never to reveal our true feelings regarding your appearance to him. You will conduct yourself with dignity and will be grateful for the opportunity you have been given. Your siblings have been informed of this arrangement and will not be expecting to see you again. Father. Charlotte read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were telling her. She was to be married. To someone she had never met. In a month. She had heard of the Marquess of Blackthorn, of course. Everyone in London society had heard of him. He was one of the most eligible men in England, wealthy beyond measure, titled, powerful. 3 years ago, he had married the Lady Eleanor Somerset, a woman considered one of the greatest beauties of her generation. He had been devoted to her, utterly besotted, had eyes only for her despite her infidelities and her cruelty to him. Then Lady Eleanor had died, not in childbirth or illness, but in a riding accident, thrown from her horse during a reckless morning ride despite warnings from her grooms that the weather was treacherous. The Marquess had gone mad with grief. He had withdrawn entirely from society, refusing all invitations, ignoring the carefully orchestrated efforts of ambitious mothers to place their daughters in his path. He had declared publicly that he had no interest in remarrying, that his heart had died with Eleanor, that he would spend the remainder of his days in solitude. But now, according to her father's letter, the Marquess had suddenly decided to marry again. And inexplicably, he had chosen Charlotte. It made no sense. The Marquess had been married to one of the most beautiful women in England. Why would he now choose to marry a woman with a birthmark? Why would he want someone society rejected? What possible reason could he have? Charlotte spent 3 weeks in a state of bewilderment, moving mechanically through her days. She packed her belongings, said quiet goodbyes to the servants who had been kind to her, and prepared herself for whatever her new life would be. She assumed, based on everything her family had told her, that the Marquess would keep her hidden away just as they had done. Perhaps, she thought, this was simply another form of exile. She would live in his country house, unseen and unheard, a wife in name only. At least in his house she might have some small measure of freedom, some ability to move beyond the constraints her family had placed upon her. She traveled to the Marquess's estate in a closed carriage, her veil drawn over her face, her heart hollow with resignation. She had learned long ago not to hope for better things, for hope only magnified the disappointment when reality failed to match expectation. The estate of Blackthorn Manor was unlike anything Charlotte had ever seen. Built in the 17th century, it sprawled across thousands of ac. Residential of meticulously maintained grounds. The stone facade was blackened by age and weather, giving it a somewhat Gothic appearance, but the grounds were pristine, formal gardens with hedges cut into perfect shapes, orchards heavy with fruit, and a great lake that reflected the March sky like polished glass. It was the kind of place, Charlotte thought, where one could be very effectively hidden. Perfect. When her carriage pulled to a stop at the grand entrance, a servant emerged to help her down. She stepped out carefully, pulling her veil closer over her face, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. The Marquess was waiting in the entrance hall. Marcus Ashworth, the Marquess of Blackthorn, was nothing like she expected, and everything like the rumors had suggested. He was severe rather than gentle, striking rather than conventionally handsome. His hair was dark, nearly black, and his eyes were a grey so pale they appeared almost silver in the afternoon light. He was tall, with the kind of bearing that came from generations of aristocratic breeding and the kind of presence that made even a vast entrance hall seem smaller. He was dressed entirely in black coat, black waistcoat, black trousers, in what appeared to be the continued mourning garb of a man still in deep grief. His expression was unreadable, his face arranged in the polite mask of aristocratic politeness that revealed nothing. He studied her for a long moment without speaking. Charlotte kept her face down, her veil as much a shield as a courtesy. She could feel his eyes on her, assessing her, and she prepared herself for the disgust she was certain would follow his assessment. "You are Charlotte," he said finally. His voice was deeper than she expected, with an accent that was refined but carried the weight of intelligence and command. "I am, my lord," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Raise your veil," he commanded, not unkindly, but with clear expectation of obedience. Charlotte's hands trembled as she lifted the veil away from her face, exposing the mark that she had hidden for 24 years. She turned her left side toward him, offering him the full view of the birthmark that she had been taught to be ashamed of, that she believed made her unworthy of love or beauty or happiness. The Marquis stepped closer, his expression not changing. He studied her face, not her mark, but her entire face, with an intensity that made her want to turn away. His eyes traced the path of the birthmark from her temple to her jaw, and then he reached out one hand and gently, carefully, touched the mark with his fingertips. "You are Charlotte," he said again, his voice different now, softer somehow. "Your father told me you were plain-faced." He was incorrect. "This mark, it is extraordinary. Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, Charlotte raised her eyes to meet his. What she found in his expression was not the disgust she had been braced for. There was no pity, no condescension, no revulsion. There was, instead, something that looked almost like wonder. "It looks like the map of some distant country," the Marquis continued, his hand still gently touching her face. "I find it absolutely compelling. I find you absolutely compelling." Over the following weeks, Charlotte discovered that the Marquis had married her not out of obligation, not out of some aristocratic necessity, but out of genuine curiosity and, she would later learn, genuine principle. The Marquess, as he asked her to call him in private, had heard rumors about the Earl's youngest daughter. In the society circles where such information traveled, someone had mentioned that the Earl of Pemberton kept his youngest daughter hidden away, that she had some kind of terrible affliction that made her unsuitable for society. This had struck Marcus as deeply suspicious and profoundly tragic. Marcus had made inquiries. He had discovered the truth, that the Earl had sold his daughter to him for £500,000, had been relieved to be rid of her, and had warned Marcus that he should expect to be disappointed by her appearance and her value. This had angered Marcus in a way he had not felt since Eleanor's death. The idea that a human being, a young woman with an entire life ahead of her, could betray it as a burden to be offloaded, could be hidden away because she did not meet society's arbitrary standards of beauty, this had seemed to him unconscionable. And so he had made his offer. Not to fix her or improve her or make her acceptable, but because he believed, in his bones, that the world's judgment was fundamentally flawed, that beauty was not what society believed it to be, and that someone needed to say that clearly, loudly, publicly. He did not hide Charlotte away as her family had feared. Instead, he took her on a tour of Blackthorn Manor, showing her gardens she could tend to, libraries she could read in, music rooms where she could play the piano that he, quite casually, asked if she had any talent with. He treated her as though she were an honored guest rather than a burden to be hidden. On their wedding night, he came to her chamber as was expected of a husband, but he did not make demands. Instead, he sat on the edge of her bed and asked her questions. He wanted to know what she enjoyed reading. He wanted to know if she had friends, and when she said no, he looked genuinely sad for her. He wanted to know what she feared most, and when she began to cry and told him that she feared he would come to hate her as her family had, he gently kissed away her tears and made her a promise. "I will never hate you," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "I chose you knowing exactly what I was choosing. Do not mistake my kindness for obligation, Charlotte. I am here because I wish to be, and I will be grateful every single day that you have agreed to marry me." Marquess did not immediately take her to London, as she had expected he might. Instead, he spent the spring and summer at Blackthorn Manor, allowing her to acclimate to her new life. He taught her to ride horses again, for she had been forbidden from such activities for years. He took her on long walks through the grounds, introducing her to the staff and the tenants, treating her introduction as though it were completely normal, the way one would introduce any new marchioness. The servants, who had been curious about the mysterious wife their master had suddenly acquired, were initially skeptical. But they quickly came to see what Marquess saw, a young woman of unusual intelligence and genuine kindness, who took time to learn their names and their families, who remembered details they told her and asked follow-up questions, who treated them with the kind of respect that many of the nobility never bothered to show the working class. It was Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Marquess since before his first marriage, who finally asked Charlotte the question everyone had been wondering about. "If you don't mind my asking, Miss Charlotte, why did the Marquess marry you?" Charlotte, who by this point had spent months with Marquess and had begun, slowly, to trust him, answered honestly. "I have been asking myself the same question, Mrs. Hartwell. I believe he feels that society is wrong in how it judges worth. He married me to prove something, though I am not always certain what." "Perhaps," Mrs. Hartwell said, her weathered face creasing into a smile, "he married you because he loves you. Have you considered that?" The question had shocked Charlotte more than any physical blow could have. Love? She had not allowed herself to even imagine such a thing. Love was something for beautiful women, for women who had been raised with confidence and acceptance. It was not something for women hidden away in the shadows of their families' homes. But as the summer progressed and Marquess continued to show her kindness, genuine interest, and affection that seemed to have no end, Charlotte began to allow herself to consider that possibility. By the time Marquess finally took her to London in the autumn, she had begun to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she might deserve the care he was showing her. London society reacted to the Marquess's wife with a mixture of shock, fascination, and scandal that was unprecedented. The Marquess of Blackthorn, the man who had been in mourning for 3 years, who had declared himself permanently devoted to the memory of his deceased wife, had suddenly married again. And not just married, but married a woman with a visible birthmark, a woman who was, by any standard of Victorian beauty, unconventional. The gossip was immediate and vicious. Some said Marquess had gone mad with grief. Others suggested he had been bewitched by some kind of witchcraft. Still others, more charitably, suggested he had simply lost his mind. But Marquess's response to the gossip was to ensure that Charlotte was presented to society in a way that made her impossible to dismiss or ignore. He took her to the opera on a Friday evening, seating her in their box where she would be visible to everyone in the theatre. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that complemented her mark beautifully rather than trying to hide it. Her hair was arranged to frame her face, and she wore emerald earrings that drew the eye directly to her birthmark. She was terrified. She had been hidden for so long that the idea of being in public, of being seen, of being the subject of so much attention, nearly sent her into panic. But Marquess held her hand throughout the evening, and when people stared, he stared back with an expression that made clear that any judgment of his wife would be considered a personal insult. The message was clear: I have chosen her. I am proud of her. Those of you who have a problem with that may remove yourselves from my presence. Slowly, over the following months, London society began to shift its assessment. The Marquess, one of the most influential men in England, was not hiding his wife. He was not treating her as an embarrassment. He was treating her as a treasure, as though her birthmark made her more interesting rather than less. Society, being generally inclined to follow the lead of those with power and influence, began to reassess their judgments. Moreover, Charlotte herself was not what society had expected. She was intelligent, articulate, and genuinely kind in a way that the many countesses and duchesses of London often were not. She moved through society without pretension, treated everyone from the highest duchess to the lowest servant with genuine respect, and seemed entirely unconcerned with the petty social games that consumed so much of aristocratic life. Within a year, Charlotte had become not just accepted by London society, but genuinely liked by it. She was invited to the most important events. Women who had previously dismissed her invited her to be part of their inner circles. Men took her opinions seriously in conversations about art, literature, and philosophy. But more importantly, Charlotte's presence in society began to shift how people thought about beauty and worth. If the Marquess of Blackthorn, a man known for his exacting standards and his genuine love for his first wife, had chosen Charlotte, then perhaps society's judgments about what made a woman valuable were not as absolute as had been believed. The impact of this shift was not immediately visible, but it was real. Young women with unusual appearances found themselves more readily accepted. Girls with birthmarks or scars or features that did not conform to conventional beauty standards found that they were not automatically condemned to spinsterhood. Society, being ultimately concerned with imitating those with power, began to consider that perhaps unconventional beauty might be acceptable after all. Charlotte, however, was not content to simply exist as a symbol or a curiosity. She used her newfound position and confidence to advocate for real change. She established a charity for children born with visible differences, a place where they could receive education, where their parents could find community, where it was made clear to them that their worth was not determined by their appearance. She gave speeches at charity functions about the harm caused by shallow judgments and the arbitrary nature of beauty standards. She wrote letters to publication editors questioning the idea that women's value could be determined by their faces. She became, in essence, a voice for everyone who had been hidden away, judged unfairly, or made to feel worthless because of something they could not control. And she did all of this from a position of genuine authority, backed by the weight of the Marquess's unwavering support and approval. Her family, watching from their various estates and townhouses, felt the sting of their earlier cruelty more deeply with each passing month. Her sisters, each of whom had achieved marriages that were considered entirely acceptable by society, found that they were now in the shadow of their youngest sister, the one they had been ashamed of. The woman they had excluded from their wedding celebrations was now at the center of every important social gathering. The woman they had considered beneath them was now advising the wives of the most powerful men in England. The woman they had been raised to believe was a burden had become a woman of genuine influence and respect. They tried to rebuild their relationship with her, approaching with careful politeness, hoping that she might have forgotten the pain they had caused her. But Charlotte, in her newfound confidence and grace, responded with something far more devastating than anger could have been. She responded with polite distance and cool civility. She did not seek revenge against her sisters. She did not publicly shame them or recount the cruelties of her childhood. She simply made it clear, through her manner and her distance, that they had lost whatever claim they might have had on her affection or forgiveness. This quiet withdrawal from their lives was perhaps more effective in demonstrating the consequences of their cruelty than any public condemnation could have been. Her father fared worse in his own way. The Earl of Pemberton, having squandered the £500,000 that Marquess had paid him on further poor investments and expensive habits, found himself in dire financial straits once again. The estates were filing. His creditors were closing in. He was facing potential ruin. In desperation, he approached his son-in-law, a man whom he had viewed with nothing but contempt and who now represented his only hope for salvation. Marquess received him in his study on a cold morning in January. The Earl, having aged significantly in the months since his youngest daughter's marriage, made his case with a voice that betrayed his desperation. Marquess listened to every word. And then, with measured coldness, he informed the Earl that he would not give him another penny. He would not bail out his investments. He would not rescue him from the consequences of his own poor judgment. And then Marquess did something worse. He told the Earl exactly what he thought of a man who would sell his own daughter into what he presumed would be captivity and misery, all for the sake of profit. He told the Earl that he considered him the worst kind of father, the kind who valued money over his child's happiness. He made clear that he found the Earl's entire treatment of Charlotte to be unconscionable and unforgivable. Word of this confrontation spread through London like wildfire. The Earl of Pemberton, once considered a man of importance and power, found himself increasingly excluded from society. Those who had cultivated his friendship for the sake of his title and wealth discovered that those things were insufficient to maintain the relationship when his character was called into question, especially when his character had been called into question by a man of the Marquess's standing. The Countess, meanwhile, suffered a stroke from which she never fully recovered, and she died quietly 6 months later, never having witnessed the full extent of her family's financial ruin or the transformation her youngest daughter had undergone. Charlotte, upon learning of her mother's death, felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Grief, yes, but also sadness that they had never been able to develop a relationship beyond the one defined by shame and rejection. Relief, perhaps, that she no longer had to harbor hope that her mother might one day accept her. What surprised everyone, including Marquess, was that she chose to advocate for her father's eventual rehabilitation. She did not forget his cruelty, did not pretend that his treatment of her had been acceptable or understandable. But she also did not require his suffering as the price of our happiness. When the full extent of his financial ruin became apparent, she suggested to Marquess that perhaps they might consider providing her father with enough resources to live modestly, without wealth or power, but without complete destitution. Marquess, who loved her fiercely, gently questioned this choice. "Charlotte, you do not owe him anything. He treated you with cruelty and contempt. Why would you wish to ease his suffering?" "Because," Charlotte replied thoughtfully, "I have learned that carrying anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting it to harm someone else. My father's suffering will not make my childhood better. My father's redemption will not erase the years I spent hidden away. But my forgiveness, my genuine forgiveness, not pretended forgiveness, but actual grace offered freely, that will free me from the burden of hating him." This magnanimity, this genuine grace offered despite past cruelty, only increased Charlotte's stature in society's eyes. She was no longer just a symbol of acceptance, she was a symbol of growth, transformation, and the possibility of choosing grace even when revenge was justified. 2 years into her marriage, Charlotte gave birth to a son, a beautiful boy with dark hair like his father and luminous eyes like his mother. His left cheek bore a faint echo of his mother's mark, a small dark patch that many might have considered a flaw, a sign of imperfection. The Marquess held his son for the first time and wept, not with tears of shame or concern, but with tears of joy and wonder. "Look at him," Marquess said, gently touching his son's cheek where the mark was visible. "He carries his mother's beauty in his very skin. This mark is not a flaw, Charlotte. This mark is a sign of his connection to the woman who taught me what true beauty is. This mark is proof that beauty is not what the world believes it to be. This mark is a gift." He named his son Edward, after Eleanor's father, in a gesture of respect to his first wife's memory. But he made clear, in every word and action, that his love for Edward was not diminished by his birthmark, that his son would grow up never knowing the world's shame, because his father would ensure that he knew only love and acceptance. The arrival of Edward seemed to mark a turning point in Charlotte's own healing as well. The nightmares she sometimes experienced about her childhood became less frequent. The moments when she doubted Marquess's love, when she wondered if he might eventually come to see her as her family had, faded entirely. She began to move through her life with a confidence and a grace that only comes from truly believing that one is worthy of love and happiness. By the time Charlotte was 30 years old, she had become a symbol of transformation in London society and beyond. She was known not just as the beautiful wife of the Marquess, for she had come to understand that she was beautiful, in her own unconventional way, but as a woman who had risen above the cruelty of her family and the limitations of society's judgment. She was a patron of the arts, supporting young artists whose work challenged conventional aesthetics. She was a champion of unconventional beauty, speaking openly about the arbitrary nature of society's standards. She was a source of hope for anyone who had ever felt rejected, ashamed, or made to feel worthless because of something they could not control. Her husband remained her fiercest devotee and her greatest supporter. The love between them was the stuff of legend, not a perfect love, for neither of them were perfect people, but a real love, built on genuine admiration, mutual respect, and the daily choice to see the beauty in each other, to choose each other again and again, even on difficult days. And in the gardens of Blackthorn Manor, where Charlotte had once feared she would be hidden away as she had been in her family's homes, she instead held court with the most fascinating people in England. Artists, writers, philosophers, social reformers, all came to Blackthorn to sit in the gardens where Charlotte had learned to love herself, to be inspired by the woman who had learned, against all odds, that she was worthy of the most remarkable love. She moved through those gardens with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth, the grace of a woman who had been genuinely loved, and the wisdom of a woman who had learned that the only judgment that truly mattered was her own. And when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a mark that made her less than. She saw a map of the extraordinary journey she had traveled, a mark that connected her to others who had suffered in similar ways, a mark that had led her to the man who loved her and to the life she had built in defiance of society's narrow judgments. The end.